A woman was found dead in her own apartment. From the outset, the investigation was filled with oddities. The most significant lead was a bite mark left on the victim by the assailant. The chilling truth remained hidden for over 2 decades. When it finally came to light, it stirred considerable shock and disapproval given its unexpected nature. Sherry Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, in the state of Washington. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters, and loving later. They moved to the city of Tucson, Arizona, where Sherry attended the local school. She was an excellent student and even finished elementary school a year ahead of her peers. Sherry completed the entire 7th grade program on summer vacation by herself. After graduating from high school in 1973, she enrolled in a California college where her older sister was already studying. In her first year, Sherry decided to pursue a medical education and become a nurse, for which she had to take additional courses at another institution. After graduating from college in 1975, Sherry decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also worked there as a nurse to pay for her education. After receiving her master's degree at the age of 23, her father bought her an apartment in the suburbs of Los Angeles, but Sherry did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father a check every month for the entire amount of the mortgage payments. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for caring for seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sherry was 27 years old, she met a man named John Ruthin. They immediately hit it off, and the couple started dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later, the couple decided to get married, and after that, John moved in to share his apartment. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Jamaica, after which they returned home to celebrate Christmas with Sherry's family. It seemed that this couple was destined for a happy and carefree future. On February 24th of the following year, when John was getting ready for work as usual, Sherry complained of feeling unwell and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours at around 7 a.m. John left for work, closer to 10 a.m. John tried to reach her by phone, but she didn't answer. Half an hour later, he tried again, but still got no answer, so he called her workplace to check if she had gone to work. But Sherry hadn't shown up at the hospital, and her sister also tried to reach her, but without success. John returned home from work at around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, even though he had closed it in the morning, and Sherry's car was missing. Therefore, he first thought that she had gone somewhere. As he approached the garage, he saw a lot of broken glass and immediately discovered its source. There was a small balcony above the garage with a glass door that had been smashed. He entered the house through the garage and, to his horror, found Sherry there. Was lying on the floor, her body badly disfigured. John immediately called the police, and detectives began to examine the crime scene. In all the rooms, there was complete chaos. Broken vases, overturned furniture, and scattered items. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently, the victim tried to reach it but failed, in addition to extensive bruises and wounds. Experts noticed a human bite mark on Sherry's wrist. Apart from all of the above, the marks on her hands indicated that the attacker tied up the victim. Before untying her, the cause of death was 3 close-range gunshot wounds. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the attacker wrapped the gun in it to muffle the sound of the shots. Detectives immediately concluded that there was a prolonged struggle between the attacker and Sherry. This was evidenced by the amount of scattered and broken items throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody mark next to the alarm button. The lead investigator quickly concluded that they were dealing with a failed robbery. According to his opinion, at least 2 criminals broke into Sherry's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be home. A struggle ensued between them, and Sherry fought for her life until the end. Several facts supported the robbery version. First, Sherry's car disappeared from the garage. Second, someone had placed the stereo equipment and player next to the staircase leading to the second floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to take them and leave, but after the scuffle and murder, they fled the scene. However, there were some dubious moments in this version. First, the police did not find any signs of forced entry, which meant that either Sherry let the criminals in herself or they had a key. Second, the perpetrators did not touch absolutely all the valuable items, including the jewelry box standing in plain sight. Detectives interviewed all of Sherry's neighbors, but it didn't yield any new leads. Some residents heard the sounds of a struggle but not gunshots. They also didn't see anyone entering the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they couldn't conduct DNA analysis. In 1985, the lead investigator also took a piece of cotton and soaked it in the trace of the bite on Sherry's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva could be left behind, and eventually, experts could use this clue to catch the killer. After a thorough search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherry and John's marriage certificate. Strange, and also raised suspicions about the man himself, but his alibi was unquestionable. John was at work until the evening, and he simply couldn't have committed this crime. He also told the police about the disappearance of this document. Detectives were unable to find an explanation for this strange fact. After a week and a half, they found Sherry's car in a parking lot 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was unlocked, and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals only touched it with gloves on, or they wiped away all the fingerprints. 2 months after the murder that took place just a few hundred meters from Sherry's home, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals broke into a stranger's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a gun, and stole stereo equipment. The lead investigator immediately thought that these 2 were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them from witness accounts, created approximate composite sketches of the suspects, and also learned that both men were Latino, but they were never found. However, investigators did not show much interest in getting to the truth, which constantly irritated Sherry's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, and asked the detectives to consider different versions. He even asked them to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend Stephanie Lazarus, who was a police officer herself. Sharia told her father several times that she was obsessed with John, but the investigators only laughed at this version. They told him to watch fewer detective shows. The thing was, as Stephanie couldn't accept John's departure and learned that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherry's workplace. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and that she and John would be together again sooner or later. In addition, she said that John had already slept with her after becoming engaged to Sherry, of course. After this visit, Sherry was deeply upset. Upon returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the young woman begged him to come over, spoke of her love, and urged him to return to her. But he said he loved Sherry and intended to marry her. Stephanie offered to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherry and said it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie gradually faded away. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times without warning under various pretexts. One time, she came with a set of skis and announced that John had promised to wax them for her the next time she entered their apartment when the man was not at home. Sherry did not even hear how she entered the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing there, the woman said she came to talk to John. Sherry had a hard time convincing her to leave later. She even thought of going to the police about this incident, but they did not. The woman was afraid that if she told them about the harassment by their own employee, they would just laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to enter the residential complex. He was surrounded by a high fence, and a special pass was required to enter. Apparently, the woman used her police badge and the security letter, and as for Stephanie's apartment, there had to be a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply could not have entered without breaking the log. Noticed that someone was following her once she and John were sitting in a restaurant, and the woman saw someone staring at them intently. As soon as she looked at this person, he immediately left. Sherry did not see his face because it was covered with a hood. Unknown calls also regularly came to their home phone, and Sherry suspected it could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any importance to his words. They were sure that the murder was committed by the two. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Some documents from Sherry's case disappeared from the police station. Among them were records of detectives about the progress of the investigation. They had to record almost every step related to the investigation of this crime, but at one point, the police simply could not find these journals. However, there were no important leads there anyway. Since then, the case has been hanging for years, and detectives did not show much. Desire to look for new leads. Despite constant pressure from Sherry's parents, 8 months after the murder, Sherry's father offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the perpetrator. A year later, he held a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases, it yielded no results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on the case retired, and the victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. Seriously? Additionally, it was 1993, and DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police to solve crimes. Sherry's father asked the detective to perform such an analysis and even offered to fully pay for it. However, the detective stated that it was pointless since they did not have a single suspect with whom to compare the obtained DNA profile. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point he reunited with Stephanie. They planned to go to Hawaii together, but something unusual happened before that. The man called the detective and asked if they had any new evidence indicating Stephanie's involvement in the murder. Apparently, he himself suspected that the woman might have done something like that, but all these years, he was afraid to talk about it, although this did not prevent him from sleeping with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was quickly climbing the career ladder in the police department. She received higher ranks twice, became Detective of the Year, and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but this did not prevent her from regularly sleeping with John. In 2001, a separate unit was formed in Los Angeles to work on unsolved murders. They were given Sherry's case along with thousands of similar cases, and the detectives began sorting through them gradually. They briefly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any clues were pushed to the end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible suspects were marked as the most promising. Sherry's murder made it onto this list because among the evidence was a piece of content that could have contained the perpetrator's saliva. Left after a bite 2 years later, detectives picked up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to high demand, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results, until January 2005. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherry's DNA, and the forensic scientists only had to study the sample from the bite mark on her body. The problem was that they couldn't find the vial with this evidence for a whole day until they finally discovered it by the wall of a large refrigerator. After studying the sample, experts found foreign DNA belonging to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately run through the FBI database, but it wasn't there. Detectives speculated that this woman could have committed the robbery with another criminal, or 2 female robbers could have broken into Sherry's apartment. The investigators still believed that the murder occurred during a robbery. Therefore, they didn't consider any other versions. After they failed to find any new leads in this direction, the case was put on hold. This continued until February 2009, when a new detective took up Sherry's case and began studying the materials left by other investigators. Seeing that DNA from another woman was found at the bite mark on the victim's body, he questioned the robbery version. Detectives considered that the motives for this crime could be completely different, so they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be related to Sherry's murder. As a result, they managed to collect 5 names, among them Stephanie, the victim's colleague at work, and 3 other young women. The detectives initially doubted Stephanie's involvement considering her reputation and successful career in the police. For this reason, he first decided to check the other suspects. Together with other investigators, they fairly quickly concluded that 3 women from this list had no connection to Sherry's death. They lacked motives and had alibis. After that, they began to investigate the nurse who worked with Sherry. Files stated that they had rather tense relations, and the police secretly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash she threw away. Experts extracted the profile and found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark location. Thus, the detectives had only one suspect left, Stephanie. He and several colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they could obtain solid evidence or disprove this theory. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily ruin their careers using her connections. They began secretly gathering information on her, trying to find any connection to the murder. Same building on the same floor as them. Because of this, the investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their notes. Soon, the detectives discovered the first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherry. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained about strange and even aggressive behavior from Stephanie. The fact that the police officer came to share his workplace in her uniform and said rude things to her seemed suspicious. Even more suspicion was added by the fact that Stephanie had broken into Sherry's gated community and even into her apartment several times. After analyzing the reports and photos from the crime scene, the detectives concluded that the possible robbery seemed staged. Nothing was taken from the apartment, not even the valuable items that were prominently displayed, but instead only a player and stereo were taken away. Moreover, the shooter had to be well versed in how the gun worked in extreme conditions. He was able to wrap the gun barrel with a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-level thief of players could possess such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another fact indicating Stephanie's involvement was a stolen marriage registration certificate found in her apartment. Why would some random burglars look for this document and take it with them, leaving a whole box of jewelry behind? For Stephanie, it could have had a significant symbolic value. Perhaps killing Sherry was not enough for her, or she had planned to break into her apartment only for this document, but the woman caught her in the act. In the end, the detective learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police station and filed a report of theft. According to this information, someone had broken into her car, which was left near the pier, and stolen several items, including a sports bag, clothes, videotapes, and a .38 caliber revolver. The gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives suspected that she intentionally got rid of the weapon, disguising it as a theft. Further, she filed a report at a different police station where nobody knew her, which seemed very strange since her colleagues would have taken the case with the utmost responsibility. As a result, the detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several officers undercover followed her for a week, until they finally had the opportunity to get it on May 28, 2009. Stephanie and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe for a snack. As soon as they left, the officers took the glass she drank from and sent it to the lab. The next day, the result was a full match. Despite the many factors pointing to Stephanie's involvement, the detectives were still shocked. It was hard for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was connected to the murder, but the DNA results were indisputable. However, at that moment, they did not have time for these thoughts, and investigators began developing a plan to arrest her. They wanted to do this in the middle of the police station, in front of hundreds of officers. Stephanie had extensive connections, and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of the murder. The chief ordered the detectives not to approach Stephanie while she had her service or personal weapon with her. He also considered the idea of arresting her in her own home risky. Since she lived with her husband and stepdaughter, the detectives began to think about how to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon, and soon they had an excellent idea in the basement of the police department. There were holding cells designed for temporary detention of criminals, so anyone entering there had to surrender their weapon to lure her. There a legend was created. Stephanie had extensive experience working in the department that dealt with art thefts. Therefore, on June 5, 2009, 2 detectives with hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have some information about stolen paintings. The detectives admitted that they were not familiar with all the details and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement, where the suspect was supposed to be held. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but there was no suspect there. Instead, the detectives gradually and very carefully laid out the cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherry's murder. At first, they simply said that they needed to ask her a few questions about an old case related to her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, they smoothly led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself. But Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherry, as it was all a long time ago. Finally, the detectives announced that they had obtained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample for comparison. At that point, the woman immediately said that she was not going to give her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer, and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several policemen with handcuffs were waiting for Stephanie at the end of the corridor. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Considering Stephanie's vast police experience, all attempts to talk to her during interrogations led to no results. She knew the situation perfectly. There was DNA evidence against her found at the bite mark on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to dispute this evidence. Her involvement, and insisted on her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents for the transfer to court over the next few years. Stephanie was held in a woman's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to basically rebuild the case from scratch because their predecessors blindly believed in a failed robbery. It was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. At the trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the DNA test results and also pointed out that there were no suspicions against Stephanie during the initial investigation, but all these arguments turned out to be completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work and entered Sherry's apartment. She went upstairs and shot Sherry once, but Sherry managed to resist, and a struggle ensued that moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her and staged a riot in the apartment, creating the illusion of a burglary. She then found a marriage certificate and left the scene after her arrest. Detectives discovered that Stephanie had boasted to colleagues about her lock-picking set, and they found several books on how to pick locks in her home. This could explain how she entered the apartment without leaving any traces of a break-in. A log of not the best quality can be picked with live picks so that no expert will notice any traces. The trial ended on March 8, 2012, and the jury found Stephanie guilty of murder. She received a sentence ranging from 27 years to life in prison, as well as an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. The judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing the time spent behind bars awaiting trial and her good behavior. Sherry's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked on the case, despite the fact that the victim's father had been telling them to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. They ignored his words. This raises a reasonable question. Were they deliberately covering up their colleague, or did they really not believe? In her involvement in the first case, it would have been a serious crime, and in the second case, it would have been simple negligence and ignoring significant facts. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had expired in this case, and the court refused to prosecute these police officers. As for Stephanie, she filed an appeal immediately after the trial, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. At present, she's 62 years old and can file a petition for early release only in 2039. Sherry's ex-husband John lost interest. In investigating her murder almost immediately after it happened, he started a new family, slept with Stephanie for a while, and later moved to another city. Detectives questioned his involvement, but this version seems unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex-wife's plans. Thus, this case could have been gathering dust in archives to this day if it hadn't fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who worked on it before refused to even consider the version of their colleague's involvement.
It took 25 years to piece together this strange tale. After leaving a party, a student from American University vanished with no trace. Despite having a suspect since the beginning, the police were unable to establish his guilt. It wasn't until the podcast's creator dug up the horrific details of the case decades later that he alerted millions of people to it and forced the police to reopen their investigation. Kristen Smart moved to the United States with her parents after being born on February 20, 1977, in Augsburg, Germany. At a young age, the family moved to Stockton, California, with a brother and sister. Her parents had a daycare center for kids of American military personnel. In 1996, Kristen entered California Polytechnic University after receiving her high school diploma. She worked as a lifeguard at the campus recreation center in her free time. A large birthday celebration for one of the students was held at the fraternity house on May 25, 1996. When her friends decided against going, Kristen went to the fraternity house by herself. The event took place in typical American student fashion. A sizable group enjoyed themselves that evening by drinking, dancing, and listening to music. Two other students, Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson, who had both been at the party, saw Kristen on the street and decided to walk her home after she overindulged and felt bad. At around 2 in the morning, Kristen went to her dorm because she could hardly walk by herself. Paul Flores, a fellow student who had also attended the party, joined them after a while and offered to walk Kristen to her dorm because he himself had not yet arrived. Lived closest to Cheryl and Tim bid them farewell before departing because they had to go in the opposite direction. Since then, nobody had seen Kristen alive. Her disappearance was not initially given much thought. Margarita Campos, Christine's roommate, was the first to express concern. After the party, she was certain that her friend would head back home, but she never did. The fact that Christine's belongings, including her wallet, bank card, and passport, were still in her room and she couldn't just pick them up and leave added to her anxiety. After the young woman vanished, Marguerite did not alert campus police until 2 days later. Campus police apparently didn't take her roommate's claim seriously, despite the fact that she apparently hoped up until the very last moment that Kristen was okay and would go home. It was the previous weekend, and the day before was the United States official Day of Remembrance, which honors fallen American service members. The fact that Kristen had left all of her valuables and important papers in the dorm did not cause any concern for the local police. They simply assumed that she had gone home. Separately, the distance between the university campus and Christine's hometown was 7 hours, making it too difficult to suddenly travel that far without money and identification, especially at night. A few days later, the neighborhood police made up their minds to report to work and called the parents of the young woman. The mother of Christine reported that her daughter had not called or visited the house in a while. The mother was alarmed by that call, and the parents went to the police. But even then, the police were reluctant to launch an inquiry. They claimed that since Christine had vanished not long ago, she might have been out with friends. The search didn't start until the 4th day after she vanished. First, but there were no results from the search. Paul Flores, who volunteered to accompany Chris to her dormitory door and was supposed to be the last person to see her, was the first person the police questioned. He told the investigators that after parting ways, SRI Kristen went to her dormitory and then to her house by herself. He allegedly went straight to bed after that, but this account quickly unraveled. Around 5 a.m., Paul's roommates observed him enter the bathroom, while he and Kristen parted ways after 2 a.m. The young man also had scratches on his knees and a black eye. When questioned by several people, he provided 3 different accounts of how he sustained all of these wounds. Despite the fact that Paul Flores seemed very suspicious, there was no concrete evidence against him. After Christine had been missing for a month, authorities had widened their search to include Christine's hometown. Because of the case's resemblance to the plot of the well-known TV show Twin, local journalists hyped it. Peaks: the young woman was killed by 2 men on campus, then driven to the cliff and thrown into the water. According to their version of events, which was even mentioned in the news. Of course, the police have no evidence to support these claims. Christine's parents filed a lawsuit against Flores a year after she vanished, accusing him of being involved in the teen's disappearance. Paul gave sworn testimony in 1997, but he only provided his name in response to one question out of all the others. Every other time, he invoked the Fifth Amendment, which prohibits the accused from testifying against him or herself. Then, Paul's parents sued Christine's family for moral damages, but neither of these lawsuits succeeded because the police lacked sufficient proof to bring charges against Paul. 6 years after Christine went missing, on May 25, 2002, the government declared her dead. They also made no progress toward cracking the case during that time. This continued until 2018, when Chris Lambert, a Californian, made the decision to launch his own podcast series on various crimes. He was 8 years old when Christine vanished, and he clearly recalled the spooky news report from that time. He made the decision to conduct his own investigation 22 years later and was shocked by how careless the police had been the entire time. Chris began by speaking with each of the witnesses to the incident. He discovered Paul Flores had a bad reputation from college students. Although the young man had repeatedly harassed female students, no official complaints were ever made. Chris further examined the police's actions and came to the following conclusion: that they had committed a number of serious mistakes. 2 months after the young woman vanished, the detectives did not show up at Ruben Flores, Paul's father. The police should have started an investigation into the residence right away given that Paul was living with his father, but when they did show up to search it, they were very careless. The detectives failed to bring a forensic expert or a police canine trained to detect the smell of decay. The search was therefore essentially fruitless. The investigators also missed looking at the Flores family's 2 vehicles, one of which Paul might have used to transport Kristen from the campus to her father's home. One of the cars was sold and the other was allegedly stolen a few months after the police visit. One of the key clues was hidden at Paul's mother's house, but the police never showed up there. 4 months after Kristen Smart vanished, Chris Lambert learned that Mary Lassiter, who had rented Paul's mother's home, had found a necklace link that was remarkably similar to the one Kristen was wearing. This necklace was also visible in photos that had been circulated throughout the city. Lassiter immediately took the evidence to the police, but they rejected it as evidence and later lost it entirely. The backyard at Paul's mother's house had always been concreted, but soon after the young woman vanished, a small piece of concrete was cut out, and a flower bed had been planted in that location. Mary Lassiter told Lambert an extremely unsettling tale every day since moving in. Mary had seen a very strange thing in the backyard of the house. Every day at the same time, at 4 a.m. and 4 p.m., I heard sounds emanating from that specific flower bed. She would hear a sound that resembled a wristwatch alarm, but it would soon stop, and it was probably the battery that had died. Christine's mother, Miss Smart, informed Chris that her daughter had set the alarm for 4:20 a.m. because she had to be at the recreation center for work at 5 that morning. Millions of people who listened to Lambert's podcast in 2019 were horrified by what they had heard, were affected by the police's carelessness and inaction. Even though there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, Chris' discovery shocked the audience even more. Since Paul Flores is still at large, the police have decided to reopen their inquiry into the disappearance of Kristen Smart. Investigators began by searching the homes and vehicles of the Flores family. When the unfortunate flower bed was finally dug up, no one was discovered inside. Even though there was no body, the experts were able to establish that on April 13, 2021, when Paul Flores and his father were detained, there were signs of human body decay in the ground. According to the investigation, Paul was charged with Christine's murder and his father was charged as an accessory. After Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson left, Paul tried to molest the young woman but was rejected. This could account for the wounds Flores sustained during the altercation. Paul had the option of murdering Kristen and bringing her body home. The father of Flores made a decision after witnessing what his son had. They took the young woman to her mother's house and buried her in the backyard, which was later changed into a flower bed, to assist him in concealing the corpse. Later, the suspects dug up the grave and took the remains somewhere unknown. Apparently fearing harassment from the police. First-degree murder was found to have been committed by Paul Flores. He could be sentenced to 25 years to life in prison by a Monterey County jury. Ruben Flores, his father, was charged with being an accessory to the crime and could spend 3 years in jail. The parents of Christine published acknowledging Chris Lambert and all concerned parties for helping to ease the family's grief over the case's resolution despite the long period of time time since their daughter vanished. One thing they ponder is whether Flora's mother was aware that her son had committed a crime. She didn't have any suspicions about the flower bed that had been unexpectedly planted in the backyard, or perhaps she had been aware of what had happened that night all along but had chosen to remain silent out of love for her son. Of course, there would be some unanswered questions, but that didn't matter right now. Maybe someday Kristen Smart will discover the remains of the young woman. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. A young woman who worked at a jewelry store vanished during her lunch break without a trace. Only a few peculiar clues and witnesses were discovered when investigators started to solve this mystery. The detectives were greatly surprised when they learned the truth only a few decades later. In the Australian city of Gold Coast, Linda Reed was born in 1962. She was raised in a devoted household, was a happy, vivacious child, and enjoyed a large social circle in school. Robert is a man Linda met. They started dating, and at age 19 years of age, the young lady wed him. They envisioned building the home of their dreams and raising a sizable, sociable family. Not long after the wedding, the newlyweds got to work on this. To get the house built as soon as possible, they bought a piece of land and started saving a significant portion of their income for construction. The couple opted to live in a trailer in Robert's parents' backyard rather than pay rent. Linda obtained employment as a salesperson at a jewelry store, and she took a job at a big shopping mall and liked it right away. She connected with the team, and the decent pay helped her save for her dream house even more quickly. Due to the impending holidays, December 1983 was tense because there was a frenzy in the shops. Linda, who was 21 at the time, had to work harder than usual. There was no exception on December 13th. Linda worked hard from the start of her shift and didn't get a chance to take a break until 12 o'clock. She typically ate lunch in the same, but on that particular day, it didn't happen. Instead, they went to the mall and came back earlier than expected. Linda had never been late before the workday started, so her co-workers were very taken aback when she still did not arrive after her break at the scheduled time. It appeared as though she had simply made the decision to leave her ship. The young woman approached her job with the utmost responsibility, so her co-workers didn't think she could do it without telling them. When Linda did not arrive home after her shift, he was also taken aback. After some time passed, he got in touch with her co-workers. When they informed him that his wife had not returned from her break, Robert's level of worry increased significantly. He went to the mall and began exploring the area, looking for Linda. The young woman frequented a number of additional locations, which he went to later, but he was unable to locate her. He was getting more and more worried that something bad had happened with each minute that went by. That evening at 7 p.m., the man made the decision to call the police because of what had happened to Linda. He was informed by the operator that a report of an adult missing would only be taken into consideration after 24 hours had passed. The mother of Linda also made contact with them but got the same response. The report was eventually accepted, but the relatives had to wait until the following day. When Linda took her break, the police started an investigation to find out what she was doing. The young lady had gone shopping for New Year's Eve. They discovered several stores are housed in the same structure. She then went to her bank branch to pick up a check to pay her bills. The last person to see her was the security guard at the mall, who had seen Linda drive away from the parking lot. The young woman's family did not know why Linda left in the middle of her shift or, more importantly, where she was going, so the police were unable to find any additional information. The police started watching Robert while also issuing alerts for the young lady and her vehicle. Statistics show that husbands or Robert had a solid alibi. No other suspects were discovered, and according to everyone who knew Linda, she never had enemies and was generally a very positive person as investigators tried to find new leads. However, it was Robert's case. More men were more likely to commit crimes against their wives. It had been several days since Linda had vanished. On the third day, a report about an abandoned vehicle matching the description of the young woman's vehicle was given to the police. It was 20 kilometers from the shopping center in a suburban area. When the police arrived, they confirmed that the vehicle was Linda's. The car was parked next to some bushes on the side of the road. This region was largely undeveloped and covered in bushes and trees in the 1980s. The police discovered Christmas presents Linda had purchased prior to going missing inside the vehicle. The ignition key was present inside the salon, and the doors were not locked. An odd clue was also discovered by the police. A pack of empty menthol cigarettes was found next to the front passenger seat. Robert and Linda never smoked, so the pack might belong to the kidnapper, investigators concluded, which was the most obvious conclusion. The police started looking for evidence right away. and shortly thereafter they made a heartbreaking discovery about 40 meters from the car in the stream bed of a small creek. They discovered Linda's body. Her hands were bound together with an eyeglass and bikini cord. According to a relative of the victim, neither of these things were ever hers. Although the young woman was also subjected to violence, medical professionals determined that asphyxiation was the cause of death. However, at the time, couldn't get a DNA sample from the criminal, so the investigators presented what they believed to be an approximate timeline of events. When Linda went to load the gifts she had purchased into the car in a shopping center parking lot, an unidentified criminal attacked her. He made her take the wheel and drive to the location where her body was later discovered. After that, he killed her and brutalized her. The investigators decided to attempt an interview because there were no leads that could point them to a suspect. Naturally, attracting the attention of everyone who was in the shopping center during Linda's lunch break was a very difficult task. The victim's car was taken by the police, who then parked it in the mall while attaching a picture of the girl and information about her disappearance. The investigators hoped that the visitors would benefit from the visual installation. On that day, who saw Linda? Organized some information. The police were informed by numerous witnesses that they saw a young person in the mall with light hair. However, detectives were unable to place him. Other witnesses related a more intriguing story. They saw a man trying to hitch a ride on the highway the day Linda vanished, less than a kilometer from where the victim's body was discovered. The van driver soon informed the police that he had picked up a man who was hitchhiking on the same day and in the same area as other witnesses had seen him. It got interesting at this point. According to the driver, the man was since an empty pack of menthol cigarettes was discovered in the victim's car. The man was seen smoking menthol cigarettes while holding the entire pack in his hand. As soon as this was discovered, forensic experts looked at the driver's van and discovered a fingerprint on the glass close to the passenger seat that did not resemble the owner's prints. Sadly, a comparison with current databases produced no findings. The driver's superficial description of the suspect did not match that of Prince, the owner, not assist in the man's capture by the police. The search for additional evidence came up empty, and the case's investigation was put on hold for several months. Not until 1985, when a prisoner in one of the state's prisons who was a police informant provided investigators with an intriguing tip, did a new lead come to light. Craig Andrew McConnell, who shared his cell with him, had told him that he had killed Linda Reed. Craig claims that Lyndon caught him and another man trying to steal a car from a shopping center's parking lot. The criminals kidnapped and killed her out of concern that she would recall their faces and call the police. The detectives were familiar with this name. Craig was a suspect in Linda's murder because he was serving 2 life sentences for killings that occurred in 1984, but the police were unable to establish a connection at the time. When they spoke to Craig in prison following the informant's tip, he insisted that he was not involved in the killing. He added that his cellmate made everything up and that they never spoke about it regarding the incident, but the police were slow to believe him. Just a few months after Linda's passing, Craig committed 2 heinous murders, so the informant's account may be accurate. The suspect's fingerprints did not match those on the van's glass when forensic experts compared them. The detectives decided to go to trial in 1986 despite this because they still thought Craig might be the murderer. The only evidence against him was an informant's claims, but he himself did not live to see the beginning of the trial. He passed away shortly before from an overdose of illegal drugs. However, the prosecution had his entire story. According to the informant Craig, who gave him a rough map of the location where he left Linda's body. Experts determined that the terrain was fairly accurately matched, right down to the location of the trees. Additionally, Craig claimed that Linda warned the kidnappers that Rob would seek retribution. The young woman actually did frequently chase after Rob. The informant that after Linda's car was discovered, he consumed a cheese and vegetable sandwich that belonged to her. Despite the fact that experts did discover cheese traces in her purse, all of this evidence was circumstantial and was not enough to support a conviction. Craig was exonerated of Linda's murder as a result. Was not enough to support a conviction. Craig was exonerated of Linda's murder as a result. Investigators tried to gather additional evidence that would enable them to obtain a guilty verdict because they still believe he was involved in the crime, but their other efforts came to a halt. When the murder investigation was reopened in 2014, 30 years after the original murder, the detectives decided to review the evidence. They gave samples of the fingerprints found on the van's glass to specialists who attempted to recreate them using cutting-edge technology. When they finally succeeded and entered the data into the database, the detectives discovered a match. Troy James O'Mara's fingerprints were found, and he was already serving a life sentence at the time Linda died. Year-old girl, and this crime's specifics were strikingly similar. When she got close to her car, his victim was coming from a store with purchases for her upcoming wedding. James coerced her to sit in the vehicle and then drove her to a remote location where he killed her after violently beating her and tying her hands. James was never considered a suspect in Linda's case and was not even on the police's radar despite this similarity. During the early stages of the investigation, the detectives remembered another fact. Several witnesses reported James, who was only 17 at the time, matched the description after seeing a fair-haired teenager in the mall's parking lot. Despite this, the police were determined to gather as much evidence as they could, and they were in for an interesting turn of events. Although it was no longer listed as evidence in the documents, it turned out that a DNA sample of the individual who had assaulted Linda had been kept at the warehouse during this time. It was almost by accident that the researchers found it, but there was one issue. The sample was local experts were unable to reconstruct the perpetrator's profile from the item because it was very small and had already started to deteriorate. The detective forwarded it to a cutting-edge lab in New Zealand, where the specialists were able to extract the profile and it perfectly matched James's DNA. Given that the criminal was already serving a life sentence, the investigation into all of this took the investigators several years. They could take their time and prepare the case for trial in the proper manner. Ultimately, James wasn't detained until August 26, 2018, nearly 35 years after the murder. The man was 51 years old at the time. He had spent more than half of his life behind bars and during that time had accrued additional charges. James managed to escape from prison once and even attacked security personnel twice, but he was apprehended the following day for the murder of Linda. Trial planning got underway after he admitted to being guilty. The process took a while, but in March 2021, the offender made the decision to confess. According to him, Linda was in the parking lot. The young lady was eating while seated in her vehicle. He offered her a sandwich before forcing her into her car and threatening to drive to a remote area where he would attack and kill her. James responded that his only goal that day was to murder a random young woman when the judge questioned him about his motivations. James was therefore given the option to apply for early release in July 2022 due to the fact that he had already served more than 30 years in prison. James was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of Linda. He is still serving his sentence as of right now, but he could be let go in the upcoming years. Sadly, Linda's father passed away before he could see the police catch her killer. After a protracted battle with cancer, he passed away despite having spent decades wanting to know what happened to his daughter. Robert promised Linda that he would never remarry after his wife passed away because he loved her so much. At the trial, following the announcement of the verdict, he thanked the investigators and said that James had permanently deprived him of his family. The circumstances surrounding Craig and the informant story are murky. Be aware that the informant was a seasoned criminal himself and would have benefited greatly from aiding in the investigation. He might have lied to the police, and all the pertinent information about the case could have been found in the newspapers. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.